Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the Human Rights Foundation and also Freedom Forum, where we had the first iteration of this panel, and we're delighted to bring it to you here in Austin. We're going to be discussing today documenting conflict zones, but specifically how authoritarian regimes obfuscate some of the human rights crimes that occur in these conflict zones. And with journalism a field in crisis now, and influencers arguably having more traction in the public consciousness, how authoritarian regimes are able to use influencers for their purposes. And so this balance between journalists, photojournalists, and collecting evidence, and then influencers and creating opinions or illusions or images of these wars. And I'll be your moderator today. My name is Anjan Sundaram. I'm a conflict journalist. I worked for about a decade in Central Africa. I've written 3 books about the region, and I'm now working on environmental conflict based in Mexico. And I have the pleasure and honor of being joined by 3 wonderful panelists, whom I'll introduce now. First off, Julianne Romy, who's a lawyer, international lawyer, formerly with Eyewitness, a mobile documentation app, and now with Global Rights Compliance. She's come here from London and will be speaking about the conflict in Ukraine. We have Abdulrahman al-Mawwas, co-founder and archive manager at the Syrian White Helmets, very important group in Syria, documenting war crimes there. And he's come to us from Istanbul today and will be speaking about the conflict in Syria. We have Darian Impiombato, who's come to us from Melbourne. She's at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and she researches China, and today specifically we'll be speaking about the Uyghur crisis and the human rights crimes and the situation in the Uyghur region. And so, yes, if we could maybe give a round of applause to our wonderful welcome back. So, Julia, I'd love to start with Julianne about the situation in Ukraine. Could you tell us a little? You've been working on human rights abuses in Crimea. Could you tell us a little bit about the crimes being committed and the work that you're doing there?
Sure. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay, so let me just start maybe with introducing global rights compliance very briefly. Global Rights Compliance is an international legal foundation that acts to enable accountability for atrocity crimes. We've been active in Ukraine since 2015, so very shortly after Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea. And since 2022, we have been part of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group that was set up by the UK, the US, and the EU to provide strategic advice to the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine in relation to investigations and prosecutions of conflict-related crimes. Crimea, let me start actually with a full-scale invasion. Since 2022, the Office of the Prosecutor General has recorded 120,000 single incidents of war crimes in the country. That's in 2 years. But obviously, the conflict in Ukraine did not start in 2022. It's been 10 years. We've just passed the 10-year anniversary of the occupation of Ukraine through Crimea by Russia. Now, last week, the Office of the Prosecutor General and the Crimea Prosecutor Office filed a submission to the International Criminal Court alleging persecution of religious minorities, in particular in Crimea. So this is something that Global Rights Compliance advised on and provided strategic support with. The crimes that have been committed there target every single religious minority that is not Kremlin compliant. So members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, Crimean Tatar Muslims, Jewish, Protestants, Catholics, you name it, except for religions that are Kremlin compliant. The Office of the Prosecutor General and the Crimea Prosecutor's Office identified several war crimes, several crimes against humanity as well. They encompass a wide range of crimes, ranging from torture, detention, killings, attacks on cultural property.
I'm curious, just to interrupt, you mentioned 120,000 war crimes. How do you go about documenting and tackling a problem on such a large scale?
Yeah, this is extremely difficult. This is a challenge that's extremely difficult for many, many reasons. The scale, first, of the crimes is extremely difficult to investigate. The number of crimes is extremely difficult to investigate. War crimes in general are extremely difficult to investigate because obviously you cannot investigate every single crime. You have to be able to prioritize, to aggregate cases, to actually go against not the direct perpetrator, but go against the higher level perpetrators, go up the chain of command, to be able to actually prosecute efficiently. And that's in the context of a country that is still at war. So we're saying 120,000 crimes currently, but the war is ongoing and growing, exactly.
Abdulrahman, maybe I could come to you. Maybe, Syria's disappeared from the front pages. We've all seen Bashar al-Assad, shaking hands with other Arab leaders. He seems to have been welcomed back into the international community, into the fold. Could you tell us about the crimes that are being, hidden in Syria because of this positive public image rehabilitated public image that he seems to have enjoyed? You mentioned, recent drone attacks and killings. Could you take us a little bit from the context to those drone attacks and tell us, the most serious issues now?
Thanks. First of all, I will introduce myself and the organization, the White Helmets. So I'm as one of the founder of the White Helmets. So we start in 2013 after the conflict started in 2 years, in 2012 in Syria. We started as a group of volunteers, young people from a different background, engineers, lawyers, workers like this, to provide the services of search and rescue, ambulances, firefighting, and help the communities. We gathering ourselves in centers because of the absence of these services, and then we established the White Helmets, or what was called the Syria Civil Defense, in October in 2014. Our main 4 programs, it's focused on the services on the health sector, search and rescue, urban search and rescue, community resilience, and the last one where I came from, the justice and accountability. So we are working as a first responders, documented what's happened, what we did respond. We believe we have to carry the rights of the victims, to document what's happened to them, and then to apply or to provide these evidences, symbols, videos, what we have for the justice and accountability. So this is in a brief. So I will back to your question. So yes, Syria now, it's not like on the first or the second on the media, especially about what's happened in Ukraine, what's happened in Gaza, but it's still ongoing. The conflict, the hostilities, the violation, it's still ongoing on the ground. From the beginning of this year till now, our teams respond to approximately 138 attacks. This attack was by the regime, the Russian and their alliance. And these attacks caused the death of 10 people and injured more than 60. So the numbers, it's not for us unimportant, but it's still ongoing. We are not talking about just numbers. Our motto is to save a life, it's mean to save all of humanity. So even if just one killed, and this is something when we discuss and think about, it's really, sorry, but it's shame on the international community, because now they're indicators about how many people killed there, how many people injured, and that's what's happening now in general in the Middle East or in Ukraine. So the attacks this year we figured out a new type of attacks, a new theme. It's called suicide drones. This suicide drones, it's controlled by the army, and it can wait for the individual, for cars, vehicles, or houses, and then it will suicide and attack in one moment to kill one or a group of the people. We respond to more than 13 attacks from the beginning of this year till now, till 29th of February, sorry. So this is in general, we back to this type of attacks and Goritesh, sorry, in 2023, informed and alert from this type of attacks, but honestly, no one care or no one take it seriously. And this is, if we compared about the last year, it was a new attack with the cross and ball missiles. And this is, it's a start in Syria, but then later it's used in Ukraine. And this is something we should worry about, what's happening in Syria and in Ukraine, how they're trying these weapons and then they move it to Ukraine, or the opposite. How is like the generals from the Russian army, they joined the conflict in Syria or the war in Syria, and they move to Ukraine to use the same tactics, and then they back to Syria to apply another tactic. So this is all dangerous. If I will move to the second question about the
I'm curious when these drones, could you give people here a sense of when a drone attack happens, how do you respond? What does that feel like? What does that look like? And can you also move us along into the conversation? In the work that you're trying to do, how do you perceive this battle between influencers and journalists how does it affect your work?
Yeah. To be honest, like the suicidal drone, when we respond, it will be less mess than the other bombardment. If we compare it with the barrel bombs, with another like attacks from the missiles or from the cluster munitions. So the drone attack, it will attack a vehicle or civilian houses directly. So it will not make like a lot of mess or explosion. And this is something we worried about because we don't have this huge network to respond. In general, when we will hear an explosion or when we will see like a smoke, then we will respond directly. Or when we have like a talkie-walkie call. But now with this type of attacks, it will be like a siren, just a little explosion, then we will respond. We published some article about this on our website, and you can see just like a vehicle, it's not like totally damaged, but the driver or the passenger, they killed directly. And this is something, as I told, like it's something, it doesn't categorize as a prohibited weapons yet, but there is a lot of cause to categorize it as a prohibited weapon. Moving to the next question about the influencer and journalist. I will just take one line from article published on the Washington Post. It says, over the past years, the Syrian regime has been recruit a YouTubers and influencer help to branch the country image. All these influencers that the regime used, they recruit by travel agencies. So in Syria now, the influencer can go to a travel agencies. This travel agencies owned by the regime family, like his wife or his uncle, and then they facilitate their visa. They will visit Syria, they will publish or they will capture videos about the food, about the culture, about the history, all these things without caring about the other things happen. In the same time, how many journalists, they apply for visa and they've been refused. So from here you can see how the journalist, the photojournalist, trying to enter this conflict zone, but there will always like a ban for them. But if you are influencer, if they following you, they know they will hire a translator to go with you where you can go and where will not go. And this is used against a lot of humanitarian organizations. We are as a White Helmets, one of them. You can see if we are a focal point with an international organization like OPCW and other organizations, and we provide evidences, samples about the chemical attacks. And this is something like a red line for the Russian and the regime. So if there is any chemical attack, if they are planning to any attack, then the social media, the influencer, they will start a propaganda against the White Helmets and against another organization. They will use the chemical attack. And this is always an alert to us because we will be afraid the regime, they will use a chemical attack in some area. So this is in somehow and the brief how they are using and trying to use the influencer.
Got it. And Darian, something very similar is happening to what Abdulrahman mentioned in Syria. Something very similar is happening in China. The Chinese government is banning journalists, kicking journalists out, preventing journalists from accessing areas where human rights abuses are happening. But something the Chinese government's doing something else that's very interesting. They're hiring both local Chinese and foreign influencers to push their case, push their story and narrative of what they want people to believe is happening in these areas. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I might just go one step back first, just to reintroduce the Uyghur region, the crisis that is still ongoing there. I think there is something like forgotten crisis. You know, a lot of people are aware of a lot of conflicts that are happening around the world, but what happens inside China, where the information environment is so strictly controlled, both for information that goes into the PRC and for information that goes out. So it makes for a very peculiar case. But the crisis in the Uyghur region, the western region of Xinjiang, has been ongoing for decades. The latest government crackdown has begun in 2016, around 2015, 2016, with the establishment of hundreds of detention facilities that the government has called re-education camps, and over 1 million people are believed to be still detained in these camps. The situation has evolved in the sense that a lot of the lower security facilities have been shut down. At my center, we have been documenting this for years. I've personally been focusing on the Uyghur region for the last 4 years. And back in 2021, I actually wrote an article saying that the crackdown in Xinjiang has shifted gear, because there is an attempt now on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party to sort of refresh the image of Xinjiang as a land of opportunities and development, and obfuscate everything that has happened and is still happening. And obviously there is still a huge issue of Uyghur forced labor, where particularly the Uyghur ethnic group is being sort of forced to be transferred to either other places in Xinjiang or other regions of China to work in factories. And the problem, back to the information environment, in the past couple of years we've been focusing on the propaganda coming out of Xinjiang. The Chinese government has been under a lot of international pressure and attention to change its policies, free these people from the camps and stop its forced labor practices. But all they've been trying to do is just sort of hide it out. And so as you mentioned, they've created this apparatus, like a sort of propaganda machine, as we call it, and it's obviously made of a lot of components. So you have the party state media, which is the establishment, but they sort of soon figured out that it wasn't as effective to reach out to audiences because it's quite fabricated and sort of it doesn't really reach broad audiences, especially overseas. So using influencers in that sense is a really good way of promoting content that looks more realistic and I guess independently produced. And it gives this sort of false sense of transparency. My latest 2 reports, the first one was focused on Uyghur influencers themselves. So there are people from these non-Han ethnic groups in China, like the Uyghurs or Kazakhs or Tibetans, who are being absorbed into this propaganda system and have been pumping out videos about the regions of Xinjiang, Tibet, etc., or sort of border regions of China, to create this sense of stability and happiness there.
I'm just curious, what do these videos look like? Are they selfies? Are they like smiling? Are they showing the beautiful landscape? Are they focusing the attention away from the crimes? Are they pretending that everything is okay, that all the activists are lying and journalists?
There is definitely a lot of that sort of fluffy content. In our report that we've titled Frontier Influencers, the New Face of China's Propaganda. If you want to check it out, there's also a few videos online where I go more in details about what we've uncovered, but we have analyzed over 1,700 videos just to give a sense of what the content actually shows. And a lot of it is not sort of directly mentioning the crime. So you would have around 5% of them where they're actively saying there is no genocide going on in Xinjiang, there is no forced labor, what the Western media is reporting is all fake news, and all those, you know, the actual victims, people who've been through the camps and have made it out, are all actors and they're all lying. And this is definitely something that comes through the videos. But the vast majority of the content is just a lot of, especially young women, sort of dancing or showcasing traditional foods or talking about traditional culture, but in a way that is extremely sanitized. It's we call it, it's a sort of party-approved minority lifestyle, showcasing the perfect minorities, of the minorities that are extremely loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and have absolutely no criticism of the regime. So I think that content is particularly insidious because if you look at it and you're not aware of what's been going on for so many years in the region, you kind of just see food and travel content, and that you know comes across as extremely innocent. But then you will go to a propaganda event organized by officials, and they will showcase these videos as proof that nothing is going on there, and there is nothing to see. And you can go for yourself on a party-approved tour to see for yourself. So
right.
That's very much the message.
So it creates this impression that you can verify the influencer's false information. That's very powerful, people feel. Even if they don't actually travel there, they feel that they can verify for themselves that nothing's happening, there's nothing to see.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, we see in a lot of conflict zones these days, even if there is no access to journalists or it becomes difficult, you still have people on the ground who manage to put the information online and it gets to us in some way. But the Chinese internet is completely compartmentalized and isolated from the rest of the world. So that side of things is not coming out. That's another side of the coin there that is peculiar to China. Like we're really missing that information, and it's that sort of vacuum of information is being filled by these influencer videos.
Just before I come to Abdulrahman, I will be opening up for questions from the audience in some time, so please think about any questions you would like to ask our wonderful panelists, and they'll be happy to answer. But Abdulrahman, I was curious, you mentioned that the social media campaigns, these influencer campaigns, they directly target the white helmets. How do you fight back?
Our plan or strategy is changed through the time, honestly. At the beginning, we didn't want to go to their square or background and going to saying, no, this is fake, because we didn't have the capacity. We is like as a humble and simple organization, so we say, okay, let's focus on our work and just ignore all this news. And it was work, honestly, at the beginning. Then later, a third party, like a big company working on disinformation and campaigns, they came and they offered to contract with us, and then they will take the information from us, and then they will go against this disinformation. And that's what we rely on. And we still believe like it will keep us focusing on our humanitarian work. We are not like a media agency, we are not a government, we're just a non-profit organization. So sharing the information, the people or the media agencies depends on us as a resource of information, and that's the strongest point. And just be a natural in our work and sharing what's happened, giving the exact information that's happened on the ground, and this is our way.
And Julianne, I have two questions for you. So you're focusing on legal solutions, and I know a lot of your work is confidential, and without compromising any of those legal processes, I'm curious how have those legal processes helped? How have you seen those help render justice or maybe diminish the human rights abuses on the ground because perpetrators now feel maybe they feel they're being watched, that you're collecting information, that these court cases are mounting. So I'm curious to hear your opinion on that. And the second thing I would love to ask your thoughts on is you used to work at Eyewitness, which is a mobile video documentation app, more than 46,000 videos collected. How are those analyzed? How are those used to either diminish the human rights abuses or bring about justice?
I'll start with the second question, because they're kind of related. Eyewitness to Atrocities is an initiative of the International Bar Association that works at the intersection of law and tech to provide a tool for documenters to be able to record crimes committed in conflict zones and share it with Eyewitness, creating a chain of custody that is then enabling footage to be authenticated in a court of law or in any other international mechanism. The way it works is Eyewitness created this app, and it's freely downloadable. You have to record the footage with the app. The app automatically stamps your footage with metadata as to the location, the date, and the time of the footage. It's impossible to edit, both by the user or a third party. That footage stays in the app, is encrypted in mini packages, and then sent to a secure server where it stays. From that moment forward, a documenter can actually take that footage and share it online. The importance of sharing that footage to the server first is that it creates a chain of custody, so you can trace the lifespan of the footage from the moment it's been captured to the moment it actually enters the server. That's what matters for courts of law. Because for evidence to be admissible at trial, notably, or for evidence footage to be trustworthy, you need to know two things. One, it's not been edited. Two, you know exactly where it's coming from. You know what happened to that footage. And that's one solution, notably. And so going back to the first question, that's one of the solutions you can have in a court of law, but not only. In any international mechanism, domestic mechanism, but also you can use that kind of solution to actually help verify what's posted on social media, which requires extreme, intense, time and resource intensive verification. You cannot trust immediately what's posted on social media. So a solution like this actually helps combat misinformation, disinformation, deepfake. It helps corroborate what others are posting as well, so that it can be used for accountability, but also for awareness and advocacy.
We've seen in many conflicts, videos are posted and they're actually from other conflicts or other regions and other situations, but they claim to be about the attack that just happened, and they're used to fool people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in Ukraine only, at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, you had videos posted online that were either completely fake, or that were video games sometimes, or that were from other conflict zones. There were videos posted of Palestine allegedly portraying the conflict in Ukraine. But you also have another type, which is videos that may be actually accurate, that are blatantly denied by Russia, for example. And I'm going to take the example of Bucha in Ukraine. So for context, Bucha is 30 kilometers away from Kyiv. It was the last stop of Russian forces before a straight line going to Kyiv. It was occupied for a month at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. And in April 2022, when it was liberated, images started to surface on social media that absolutely shocked the world. You had hundreds of civilians lying in the street, dead, their hands tied in the back. You had instances of potential sexual violence. You had detention, you had killings, you had torture. You had it all, and it was all there for everyone to see. Russia was extremely quick to deny its involvement and to deny the involvement of its troops in anything. This message was amplified by pro-Russian accounts on social media, so it was extremely difficult to prove their involvement. And what happened was photojournalists coming in, or journalists in general, coming in to Ukraine, interviewing witnesses, interviewing victims, reviewing hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage, CCTV, footage captured by residents of that town, tracking phone records to actually debunk Russia's allegations that they were actually not involved. But when you look at it, it took, so I'm going to take the example of the New York Times investigation in that particular area. We're talking about one location. It took 8 months of an investigation for that report to come out and say, actually, Russian troops were involved, and we've identified a number of people. 8 months for one location. So now take that and put it in the context of one country where war is still raging, right, where cities are still occupied. It's extremely difficult.
Sure, and that brings me to, I guess, before I open up to the audience for questions, it brings me to a question for each of you. We have in our audience today, technologists, journalists, activists. What kind of help do you think is necessary for your solutions? We've spoken a bit about the solutions. What kind of help do you think could be necessary? What kind of collaborations could be useful to scale up these solutions, to make them more effective in each of your regions? If maybe, Julianne, you could start, and then or Abdulrahman.
I just have a comment about the question to Julianne, about the videos and the Eyewitness and this program in general. As the Syrian conflict, it was the most documented war in the history. There is 100,000 of videos published in open sources and offline sources about what's happened in Syria. And this is something it's really important and useful to think about. We shared a lot of videos and photos for many attacks and used as evidence. It started as data and then it's become as evidence. And in the other hand also, I think you heard a lot about some national courts against perpetrators in Syria, perpetrators even with the regime or with armed group, and they now on the jail or under the court, even in Germany or Sweden or France. And most of this information it becomes from open sources, from these videos. So we should think also about how we use this technology, how these videos, it's really important about the justice. And even if it's on the Eyewitness or other apps or in the tube in general, but it's really important to use for justice, even now or in the future. Sorry, but to your question.
Go ahead. I'm curious to my question. Maybe we can start with you and then we can...
I think about what we expected from the audience, from the people, it's really simple about just to go behind the truth, to check this information. Now it's open sources. Julian mentioned something published in Ukraine, but it's happened in Palestine as example. Or we were during the earthquake, there is a lot of photos used related to the conflict, not the earthquake itself. And in every a TV channel or in a media agency, there is something called a department fact check. But now in the social media, in the influencer, in all this information, there is no this filter, no this fact check. They are trying to do, but it's still fake and it's not something easy. So I would ask first to check this information, to try to hear from different sources the reliability of this information. It's really useful. And on the other hand, how to advocate with any case. After we know the truth, after we know who is the perpetrator, who is the victims, then we can start to advocate about this in our community, and it will affect at the end, maybe on the national or international level.
I have some pretty specific ones for particularly the tech industry. I think in general we should work towards more transparency, both of content moderation practices and content takedowns, and come together for more, agreed standards. Because I know that a lot of tech companies are working on these in silos, and that is not helpful. For these things to be actually effective, you need action across the board. You can't just focus on the single platforms because, the influencer will just pop up in another platform. One thing that is specific to YouTube is stopping influencers who are based in the PRC from monetizing their content on the platform, especially if there is sort of verified links to the CCP. But in general, all our sort of non-Chinese platforms are banned in China, so that should kind of be reciprocal. I think we need more labels for influencers. Ideally, you'd have more disclosure of where their funding is coming from. In an ideal world, I know that it's probably not going to happen, but there is a lot of research going into this. So once they are identified, they should be labeled as state-affiliated. And I think more in general, we need better tech regulation. So if you allow me, I'll just do a little plug. My institute, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is going to run a tech summit in Sydney in September, the 2nd and 3rd of September. And it's meant to be the leading tech summit in the Indo-Pacific. So we'll bring together government, industry, and civil society to discuss better tech policy. If anyone is interested, please come and find me after this.
Great. Julianne, would you like to close out?
Sure. I think a lot of what I want to say is very similar. I think importantly, we need to check what we're reading before we repost, and that applies to every single one of us. We've all been fooled by information that we thought was true, and then we've reposted and we've shared with people. And that's how misinformation, disinformation, propaganda actually is amplified. Second call, I think, is also for all of us, which is provide the tools and the means to document her, provide them a voice, amplify their voices. A lot of conflicts, and you were mentioning that, Darian, earlier, a lot of conflicts are forgotten conflicts. We also need to think about all these conflicts that are currently ongoing that we just kind of forget about once a new conflict erupts. And that's really, really important for victims, that we don't forget and that we keep advocating. The third call, I think, is more geared towards, I guess, policymakers. Journalists have codes of ethics. They're bound by ethical principles. There's about 400 codes of ethics worldwide. And there's a reason why journalists are more trusted than anyone else. They are trained to be neutral observers. They're bound by accuracy, truthfulness, do no harm, objectivity, impartiality types of principles. Influencers are not. And I think it's really important to start thinking about a potential code of ethics for influencers. That would include transparency as to their affiliation, responsible use of their platform, being mindful of their reach, being more humane, do no harm as well. I think that's something we really need to start thinking about.
Those are great points, and I think we could talk for much longer about this, about why influencers are incentivized, the financial incentives versus the financial incentives for journalists, and the ethical incentives, and on the one hand, and the lack of them on the other, and why influencers hold so much sway over society, why journalists are not able to persuade or losing ground in this information war, I would say.
If I can just sort of add to this point, I think what we've noticed in the content, we obviously, there has been a lot of reporting done on these issues, and in particular in Xinjiang, using it as an example, there is content on the social media platform, but it's one in a while, because we pour so many resources into the investigations for it to be corroborated and to verify all the videos. That takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. And then you put out a really credible piece of evidence that is very useful, but it is watched once and then it gets drowned into this other myriad of content that is very cheap to produce. And it's almost like an army of influencers you can have on hand. You don't even have to pay them because they're getting money from the platforms. So it's very efficient.
Yes, and I felt the same in my reporting about dictatorships and so on. I feel like, the articles, somebody's reading it over coffee and then they turn the page or scroll and then it's just lost.
You spent 1 year on it, yeah.
In a sea of images. I'm curious, does anybody have questions for our panelists? You just.
So I have a couple of questions, but we'll start with one. So I'm assuming you get a lot of backlash from whatever you produce. So how do you deal with backlash that arises from reporting or research about from regimes that you're inflicting essentially about information, especially in cases where they're fighting propaganda?
So there are troll armies. What's your life like when you publish the truth? Go for it.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, honestly, but it's when it comes to publish something true and rely on this, and especially with the community that's suffering from this, let's say, attack or hostility violation, and then something it's come against it. And it will come, as you mentioned, with like an army. We know like there is like an electronic Russian army. It's always like targeted a specific information and the news. And we were on their like scope for like years. And I think now they are less because they are more like busy or like focusing on Ukraine and other like areas. But it comes to us how we will spread this information. In the local community, it will be easy because in the local community, we know the people, how they will follow this. But when it comes to Europe, to the States, to these areas, we don't have like this reach or access like them. So this is the difficult thing. We don't have these tools to make it. So as I mentioned before, like we're trying always to find a new methods and new ways with our partner, with our or third parties to publish this truth. But we don't know like at the end what it will stay for the history. We made a huge project. It's called the Justice and the Accountability. It's focused about the visual documentation, data to document what's happened in Syria. Till now, since 2021, January 2021, till now we archive, categorize, and analysis more than 95,000 videos. But at the end, we put just like one motto for this project. If it's not for justice, it's for history. So this is the latest things that we can do.
So that's the information war aspect. I was curious, is there a personal aspect also? Or just,
I can
health?
talk a bit to that because it brings me to a bit of a separate but related issue of transnational repression, which I care a lot about as well, and I've done a bit of work in. A lot of these regimes have power to contain or mute dissent overseas as well. And a lot of activists are threatened on a daily basis. Their families, if they have family back home, they get called in by the police and brought in, sometimes detained, unfortunately, or disappeared. So I think the activists are definitely on the front line of that, but there is an impact on journalists and researchers as well. I've had colleagues who have been, their life has been impacted significantly. Attempts by the PRC to silence us are constant. Constant battles with the Chinese embassy in Australia, but aside from that, even the influencers that we have exposed, they have a big platform and they have, gotten back at us to defend themselves, but I guess also to attack us back. So you get a lot of that online trolling, which can have a huge toll on your mental health. And so you need additional resources to make sure there are still people willing to do this work and willing to come out and speak up, because it has an incredible chilling effect over the community. Why would you go out and expose yourself and risk your life, risk the life of your family for this work? It becomes like a really big choice to make. And a lot of people can't make that choice, but you know, I work with a lot of people who stay anonymous to avoid those consequences. So I guess in terms of solutions, I think thinking about that problem is really important as well, because if we're trying to protect this content, we need to protect the people who produce it as well. So thank you for the question.
You need to defend the defenders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions?
One of the aspects of the internet that I think is also spoken about is when it comes to documenting these conflicts. It's not just misinformation or influencers, but it's also the virality and trendiness of the internet, right? For example, the current humanitarian crisis with the Uyghurs in China, I know was like a massive thing that was spoken about a lot 4 or 5 years ago. It was something that was brought to Congress and to the UN, all of that. And to be completely frank, these days I don't hear that much about it, right? I know currently Palestine is on everyone's tongues, but this that has been going on for years, and once like the violence dies down just a little bit, it just kind of it's ignored once more. And so how, from y'all's organizations, how do you guys try to combat that? I know it's a very difficult thing to do because it's just what people are talking about. It's difficult to like keep it on everyone's minds. But what are some of the things that you guys try to do to just keep that information going so that people continue talking about it?
Well, the Oslo Freedom Forum actually does help us with that, like brings people, brings activists, brings change makers to the stage, you know, gives them a voice and makes them newsworthy, and that's one way. But I'm curious to his question, how do you make it trendy?
I guess, well, so with global rights compliance, I am working exclusively on Ukraine, but when I was with Eyewitness to Atrocities, we used to work across the globe. And one of the things we were doing was to, you know, produce reports and, you know, put things online and bug UN special rapporteurs and, you know, produce more reports and advocate at the Universal Periodic Review, which is review every 4 years of every single country in the world that is public, and it's, you know, it's a state review of other states. So multi-states review of another state, and that's kind of how you get the, you know, the story going. But I agree, it is extremely difficult to keep something up there being discussed and being acted upon, because it's not only about discussing it and being aware of it, it's also about actually acting on it. Unfortunately, a lot of things are extremely political, a lot of things are also very resource intensive. You know, talking about the International Criminal Court, we would want the International Criminal Court to pay attention to every single conflict, but they don't have that funding, so they do have to prioritize as well. And it is the same with every single domestic or international mechanism. So yeah, I think we just need to keep pushing.
Abdulrahman, you spoke about journalists being banned, you know, Syria's off the front pages, coming back to our initial, where we began. So how do you combat that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for that. But when I compare what we watching on our mobile phone about like a conflict, let's say in Ukraine or Palestine, and what we like see on another hand with like influencer showing you like flavor, foods, dancing, or this thing. So with the first case, you will see it for the first day, second day, but then at the end, yeah, it will be challenging to still see like this suffering, injured people, no humanitarian aid, besieged, all these things. Like this one, the other one, it will make you feel more comfort. But this is our rule and our human rights organization to keep it not like a trend, but just to keep it heard, to keep it watched. We spend a lot of efforts. We're trying with our media advocacy partners and departments to make this just like the people to know what's happened. And I think recently during the last, like, I would say 5 years, something it changed because the people now they are aware about what's happened. If you look about the states and I will say it, but like the government position about what's happened in Palestine as example, but on the other hand, how many people still demonstrate and going and saying and believe about like other hand or another side. So this is something it can lead or it can like give us a hope. The people, they still like heard this news. They still believe there is something they can do to change. Even the rules or the policies or the decisions at the end, but our work to still keep doing and doing this.
I can just maybe add that it is extremely difficult. I think it's pretty much impossible to keep that attention society-wide across the board. There's just too much going on and you kind of get people overwhelmed. But there is a lot going on behind the scenes, and I think the Uyghur crisis is quite well known in the United States because there has been a lot of action happening here, and with the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, you can see now some practical consequences happening, so that is good. And there is a lot of discussions now in Europe around forced labor legislation and how to pass that, and a lot of companies like Volkswagen or other German car manufacturers and so on, they're being pressured to pull out of Xinjiang. So while these news may not make sort of international headlines all the time, what we do is work behind the scenes as well with policymakers and advise them on how to pass better legislation. It's not sexy content, so it won't end up on social media or anything. And I think that's sort of the main conundrum there, like between photojournalists and influencers, because we get asked sometimes, why don't you get influencers as well? And it's like, well, I think some people do, and I know there are a lot of human rights organizations are now working with influencers to, promote these messages a bit more. But when it comes to actual, legal action or policy action, it just is not as easy to do that.
And I guess, as a journalist, more and more journalists, I think, are becoming influencers or adopting some of those strategies to make themselves become figures of influence and, figures that are watched. So that's an evolution that I see in my own field. Yeah. Sure.
I had a question about journalists' safety and sustainability. How much progress has been made in terms of protecting journalists in conflict zones? Have things improved with greater UN presence? And is it, where do you see this going in terms of, because the value of journalism is very high. I'm just curious to see, curious to learn from you whether things have improved over time and where you see journalist safety going.
Maybe you can
Yeah,
start
sure.
answering that.
It's a hard question because I think there are two kinds of journalists. I certainly see that full-time journalists that are hired and working full-time for organizations, I see far more protocols. Whereas for freelance journalists, I think the situation, especially financially in terms of institutional support, has become far more precarious. There are ecosystems, there are informal ecosystems. For example, I'm a freelance journalist, and when I travel, there are organizations such as Article 19 that monitor my travel. I check in with them every 3 hours. They even inform my mother. If my mom hasn't heard from me for a bit, they'll play that role, which is important for mental health of not only the reporter, for the family, the ecosystem. I would say on the positive side, a lot of these topics are being discussed far more deeply than 20 years ago when I started to be a journalist. My editors didn't even ask me about my mental health or the mental health of the people I'm interviewing. I'm asking people to, recount possibly traumatic events, relive those traumas possibly to some degree. What's the impact of that questioning? What is my responsibility to them? And all those questions are being asked now, and I see that as a positive in the field. And I think ultimately it's better for everybody. The journalists, the subjects, the stories, they're told more sensitively, collected more sensitively. Ultimately I think it's better for everybody. Because there has been in the past, rightly so, a sense of extraction. Journalists come in, they extract, and then people are just left there. Sometimes the story's published, sometimes the story's not published. It's been a legitimate question, and I feel like the community is now, journalistic community, is now doing more to engage with that in a responsible, meaningful way. And I think that also has security implications. The community support you, protect you. Because ultimately, as a journalist, when I'm traveling, I'm at the mercy of the communities, and I depend on them for my security. They're the ones who tell me if something's safe or not. I'm often traveling there for a week. They live there, so the information asymmetry is just huge. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Two questions. Maybe it's one question. Is there a specific profile of a bad actor influencer? So is it like a male 20, 30 years old? Is it all over the place? Or that research just doesn't exist? And the second sort of sub-question is, what are young people involved into that whole picture? Because on one hand, I would imagine that they would be much more malleable to, capture that experience to become these, bad actor influencers. But on the other hand, it's not a person who goes to Moscow to the grocery store, for instance, but life in Russia is just like everywhere. So I'm just curious.
So we have only 5 minutes left, so maybe we can make this the last question. I'm just curious. Yeah, profile of the influencers and young people. What role do they play in this ecosystem?
Yeah, I love that question, but my answer is going to be very context specific, so it is not. I think it would be different. So my research has been into the PRC, so take it for that. Our last report called Singing from the CCP's Song Sheet actually takes profiles, a few influencers as case studies, because I think it's really important to look at them as, the human beings that they are and kind of see their pathway into it, how they get into it. I think the local ones that we analyzed in the frontier regions were primarily women, primarily young women. And so you see of minority groups. So you see, using that to promote an image of China that is very malleable and lovable, and that comes through in Xi Jinping's speeches. So we compare that, like the directives that the party gives all the way up from the top down to the local level to promote that image of China. You see it reflected in the content that's being promoted. When it comes to foreign influencers, a lot of them are actually male. I would say the age varies. We have a few examples, who are like maybe in their 30s or a little bit younger, but then you also have this like middle-aged man with, It is quite bizarre. A lot of the times, like they become maybe like a bit isolated in their countries of origins, and then they come to China and suddenly they are like popular, and so it kind of gets to their head. And like some of them actually work for party state organizations, but they don't disclose that on their profiles. But you should read my report. It's really quite interesting. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. Bad influencer. I cannot say like who is bad and good influencer, but we were discussing this before come to here. And I think the motivation and the purpose of each content and if each influencer, it can give us like what is the good and what is the bad content. And this is something it's really important, especially you are in a space that is no rules no regulations, and you can publish what you can. So what is the purpose? What is the motivation? We can judge on that. And at the end, we are, as a people, we are making this influencer by watching them, by following them, by giving them dislikes, and it reflects on their content and their, I will say, like, not their career. I didn't believe it's a career yet, sorry for this, but it's in their income or in something how they will be more popular. But yeah, I think the motivation and the purpose of their content, it will give us like the way or the thing that we can judge on that.
No, okay. Thank you for these insightful. I hope the conversation was insightful. We had an international policy perspective on the Uyghur region. We had an international law perspective on Ukraine, and we had direct relief and aid on the ground in Syria. Three different, very different, but related perspectives. So maybe we can give them.